The action takes place at a luxurious ball, where high-born couples leisurely dance surrounded by expensive jewelry. A young man in noble clothes approaches one girl. Bowing low, he asks his interlocutor to forgive him. In response, the woman is very surprised and can only say one thing, a short but loud, "What?" The lady simply cannot understand what offenses this man is asking for an apology for. And besides, she is not able to remember who he is. However, the girl notes that the stranger is surprisingly handsome. He has a young, handsome face, short brown hair, and a noble profile that even tears did not spoil. But it is all the more suspicious that the owner of such a beautiful appearance suddenly began to beg for forgiveness. Here the heroine had a possible guess, and it made the girl's heart beat in anticipation. But a second later she was mercilessly disappointed. The young man wanted to break off their engagement. This amazed and offended the girl to the core. Not only would she not get such an enviable husband, but she would also be rejected by a guy whose name she didn't even know. Continuing to bow and shed tears of remorse, the young aristocrat adds that tomorrow he will send a separate letter of apology to the family of his would-be bride. The girl grabs her curls. What is happening more and more reminded her of some kind of ridiculous theater of the absurd, because the heroine still had no idea who this person was. Finally, the young man admits what the matter is. He decided to become a priest and devote his life to serving God, for which he will have to leave everything worldly. Having proudly expressed all this, the boy hastily leaves, without even giving his ex-fiancée the opportunity to ask a question or explain herself. As a result, the unfortunate girl was left standing alone, shocked and perplexed, while the other visitors to the celebration watched it as if it were a performance. A nervous laugh ran through the noblewoman's thoughts. She didn't understand anything at all and continued to feel like a character in some bad comedy. With difficulty suppressing the laughter bursting out mixed with hysterical crying, she silently begged someone to finally explain what happened here. Unfortunately, the lady did not have enough self-control. She actually laughed in shock and hugged herself, like a victim who had survived terrible violence. Those around her began to whisper. As it turned out, this was not the first time before that the poor aristocrat had already been abandoned by gentlemen twice. The guests sighed at how terrible it was to experience a broken heart, not just once, but 3 times. But they didn't really feel any sympathy. For these predators, the poor girl became something of a target for ridicule. This did not escape the heroine. All these impudent and sarcastic glances mixed with malicious whispers made her feel uneasy. Then a woman very similar to her ran up to the young noblewoman, a little older in different clothes but with almost the same golden hair. The girl, whose name was Serena, out loud calls this lady Mom, but in her thoughts she is surprised by such a reaction. The heroine's mother was indeed very similar to her daughter. The only noticeable difference between them was the color of her eyes. Serena's were blue, and her parents' were unnaturally purple. The older woman was very alarmed by how much her beloved baby had turned pale, so she suggested that the heroine go home to rest. Obediently following behind, the protagonist continued to think about the strange things happening to her. She could not understand why the name Serena seemed somehow familiar to her. Outside, a carriage was waiting for the women, richly decorated, and as if it had come from a fairy tale about Cinderella. But the main character was still puzzled and depressed, as if she was expecting something else. After some time, the ladies arrived at a small but richly furnished estate, where Serena was quickly put to bed. Before leaving, the mother gently patted the girl on the cheek and asked her to go to sleep. Sleep is the best way to relieve stress and anxiety. But the protagonist, of course, had no intention of falling asleep. As soon as Mother left the threshold, she opened her eyes, in which there was no hint of a desire to take a nap. In fact, she was as terrified as if she had just been chased by a crazed killer. And the thought that everything that was happening could just be a prolonged dream did not seem so bad to her. But then the girl quickly calmed down and fell silent. She sat for a while, quietly thinking about something, until she finally remembered something very important. Readers are shown a flashback in which an unknown girl in ordinary earthly clothing is hit by a huge, speeding truck. Instinctively, she tried to cover herself with her hands, but this, naturally, could not stop the multi-ton mechanism. What happened next was not one of the girl's favorite memories. In fact, the memory of that hellish pain makes her tremble and sweat with fear. Because of this, the main character does not even immediately realize that if a huge machine broke all her bones, then how can she be here alive and well? Then the young aristocrat turned her gaze to the large mirror. It stood right next to the bed so that her mistress could evaluate her appearance at any time. Jumping out of bed, Serena ran to the accessory in fear, as if trying to make sure that what she saw in the reflection was reality, and not the ghosts of a tired mind. There she saw a young, thin, but very beautiful young woman, with blue and deep eyes like clear lakes, and long hair the color of gold. Then the protagonist again remembers her death. Before the accident, she looked completely different, had shorter black hair and the same eye color. At that moment, her whole life flashed before her eyes. And this was not a metaphor. She really saw herself in an unknown space, surrounded by film. In it, the main character saw herself, first as a tiny crying baby, then as a girl learning to walk, as a schoolgirl bored at her desk, and so on until adulthood. But then something even stranger happened. In addition to chronicling her life, the woman saw a film that depicted excerpts from Serena's biography. In one shot, an unknown man named Isaac mercilessly told the blonde that he was breaking off their engagement, and she, crying bitterly, tried to convince him not to do this. Here, an unknown black-haired girl wearing a dress with a red corset stood up for Serena. She accused Isaac of meanness, and he asked who she even was. Not at all frightened by the anger of the distinguished guest, the brunette with eyes blazing like two fires introduced herself. She was Rosetta, the daughter of Earl Hayes. Only after this did the protagonist, stuck between life and death, finally realize who all these people were and why their images seemed suspiciously familiar to her. They turned out to be characters in a novel that the main character read shortly before her death. It is called The Despicable Leopard Princess Must Save the World, and Rosetta was the main character. And the blue-eyed blonde, who was so often and cruelly rejected by suitors, was Serena Ethereal, and she turned out to be nothing more than a minor character. After this realization, the main character's mind finally returned to reality. Her body, crippled by the truck, was pierced by terrible pain, but she quickly lost consciousness. Right now, Serena felt her face in horror. She could not believe that it was really real and that the world around her was not a dying delirium. The protagonist felt the skin on her face for a long time, until she decided to slap herself. But the discomfort from the blows was so natural that no mask or dream could simulate it. After that, she again began to peer into the reflection, remembering how the true owner of the body was described in the original work as a wondrous beauty, as if she had appeared from a fairy tale. There could be no doubt. She really ended up in the body of Serena Ethereal, the heroine of a popular Asian novel and the daughter of a small nobleman. According to the plot, this girl was one of Rosetta's close friends, and the story took place in the world of Delcato. Local nobles had supernatural abilities, and their clans were named after animals. The same Rosetta, for example, was one of the daughters of the head of the Hayes Earl family. The leopard, one of the most dangerous predators on Earth, served as the totem of this venerable family. However, the brunette was unlucky. She was born a completely ordinary person, so those around her mercilessly mocked her all her life. Naturally, in the end, Rosetta discovered hitherto dormant abilities in herself and began to use them in order to solve problems arising throughout Delcato. In the end, Hayes defeats the Dark Lord, who was trying to destroy the entire world with terrible spells, thereby finally winning the love and adoration of other people. The ending of the original story was happy but banal. Rosetta married the second main character, although before they could not stand each other. Knowing all this, the trapped woman could not understand why, of all the possible candidates, her soul was thrown into the body of an insignificant heroine of the third plan, which did not in any way affect the main plot. The original Serena was abandoned 4 times by potential suitors, which is why the unfortunate girl became a real laughingstock in the eyes of the rest of the nobility. Moreover, the reasons for the disagreements each time were as ridiculous as possible, as if the universe itself decided to mock Ethereal. For example, her first betrothed eventually decided to marry her own maid. The second gentleman eventually fell in love with his own maid and decided to run away with her. He left only a letter with an apology for the blonde, which looked more like a sophisticated joke. Finally, The third groom declared that he wanted to devote himself to serving higher powers, assumed the rank of priest, and renounced any ordinary pleasures. The last betrothed was Isaac Richard, the same second protagonist of the novel, a representative of a rich and powerful family whose totem was the lion, the king of beasts. This young duke treated Serena like a scoundrel, abandoning her during a noble reception in front of dozens of people because she seemed so boring to him. It was then that Rosetta came into play. That ball was her first outing in high society, but seeing her friend's humiliation, she did not hesitate to stand up for her. And, ironically, this is how her romance with Richard began. Although not immediately, these two characters gradually realized how attracted they were to each other and got married, and all the misadventures of poor Serena were nothing more than a way to introduce them. Thinking about this, the current owner of the ethereal body explodes with righteous indignation. It seems to her that this was unjustifiably cruel to an innocent person. She even remembers how she witnessed the penultimate breakup, how the newly minted saint left her without thinking about the feelings of her ex-fiancé, and the heroine almost cries with pity. But then, the main character decisively shakes her head in different directions, as if driving away an annoying midge. No matter what happened before, she is now Serena Eternal, and it is up to her to live this whole new life. However, the blonde thinks wistfully that if an unknown higher power threw her mind into the body of the main character with all her cool skills, it would be much easier. Then the protagonist is pierced by a realization. She completely forgot what happened to the old owner of her body after the quarrel with the Lion Duke Richard. With a slight racking of her brain, the former Earthling recalls that after that, Serena's entire role was to occasionally appear in Rosetta's company and admire out loud her incredible strength. Even at the end of the novel, when Hayes married Ethereal's old fiancé, the blonde sat modestly in the corner and clapped joyfully, watching someone else's celebration. Perhaps someone else would have felt intense envy, realizing that he was destined to become just an extra from the crowd, framing someone else's greatness and happiness. But the misfit thought that being Serena was not bad at all. Smiling slyly, the girl began to recall the events of the past day. Since today she had just been rejected by her third groom, this means that only Isaac remained. She had already been abandoned 3 times for the most stupid and insulting reasons. She just had to endure the last, the 4th. After this, all the young Eternal's misfortunes will end, and she will be able to fully enjoy the benefits that her new body gives her. The title of Countess and wealth are what literally turned the hit woman's head. For a moment, she even imagined herself in a luxurious white robe, with a cocktail in her hands, relaxing in the rain of gold coins. The picture, no matter how fantastic and ridiculous it may seem, was still terribly seductive. The heroine's mouth literally began to water. Then she came to her senses and grabbed her head. No matter how close the finish line was, it was too early to rest. The girl clenched her fist belligerently and exhaled a whole cloud from her nose, like a bull. In fact, nothing special was required from the landing from Earth. It was only from the exhibition the audience learns that magic in the world of Delcata is inherited. The ethereal genus has as its coat of arms the duck, a small waterfowl. In contrast, Isaac Richard was created by the author of the original novel as a real Marty Sue, a brilliant sorcerer who has enormous power. The Leo family is associated with flame, and Isaac's power is great enough to burn down an entire village. By the way, he also has the gift of treating others with his hands, and since such for all this, as well as for his outstanding personal skills, Isaac, thinking about all this, the poor woman asks a logical, but then the girl decides that she doesn't care. She will still end her marriage with the young duke, after which they will never meet again in their lives. Coming out onto the balcony of the estate, Ethereal looks into the distance with a dreamy blush. In her past life, the main character, like many people with little income, and not only him, outside the window there was a magnificent garden of such a size that one could easily play football on. Yes, the protagonist's family cannot be compared with the Duke's Richards, but they still remain rich, and the fact that the soul of the dugout was thrown into the body of their daughter and not some peasant woman was incredible luck. Dancing, the joyful girl returns to her soft bed. And she has nothing left to complete happiness. She just has to wait until they decide to marry. Some time passes. Serena managed to fall asleep, but then the protagonist naturally did not want to get up, but the unknown voice was the young aristocrat, trying to stay in Morpheus's arms, turned away. As a result, the blonde's nerves could not stand it. She suddenly jumped up and screamed throughout the bedroom. What the hell did those around her want? But then there was an awkward silence. Ethereal saw no one. Then he speaks again and Serena clutches her head in horror. For a moment, then the irritated invisible man demands that the main character look down. But it was just a tiny, fluffy duckling. He stood with his wings on his sides like an irritated grandfather watching his careless granddaughter. Realizing that he had finally been noticed, the chick immediately began to grumble and scold Serena. In the end, she only managed to mumble that there was a talking duck in front of her, to which the bird reacted with even greater irritation. The protagonist reacts to this with fury. Clenching her fist, she was about to say that yes, but then she realizes the ethereal is now not on Earth, but inside a fictional work in which thinking and since the trapped woman has not gone crazy after the stress she has experienced, the chick did not like this treatment at all. He struggled in the hands of the noblewoman, shouting indignantly that she had no right to. As a result, the bird announced that if Serena did not stop immediately, he would be forced to take action. To say that Ethereal was shocked would be an understatement. The blonde slurred her tongue and asked. Then the main character decided to take a different approach. Then the duckling fell silent, rubbed his head, and demanded that his interlocutor. There was nothing to do. The girl went to the kitchen, sneaking around and maintaining the most serious look, as if she were a spy wandering around an enemy fort. In her thoughts, Serena continued to be indignant. She was shamelessly. But the kitchen was not empty. There were two girls in the classic black and white maid uniforms, and they were, unlike the hypocritical aristocrats, they sincerely felt sorry for the young girl, whose heart had already been broken 3 times by high-born idiots, and one of the maids even begins to cry. The asshole couldn't reveal her presence, but silently she warmly approved of such thoughts. There was nothing funny about bullying the real Serena. However, there is always a silver lining. The servants somehow heard gossip that the 4th groom of their young mistress would be a member of the. This shocks one of the girls. Not only has not even a day passed, the protagonist is also very surprised, but the conversation becomes more and more. The servants are most interested in why such an influential person as the head of the clan, Richard, chose as his bride an aristocrat. Listening to all this, the main character forgets herself and intervenes in the conversation. With a mysterious look, pressing her finger to her lips, realizing that the aristocrat had been listening to their conversation all this time, but Serena just waves her hand carefreely. The maids didn't say anything seditious, and besides, she completely agreed with. In addition, she did not disdain to admit that the situation really looked very strange. For the great and powerful clan of lions to descend to humble, Popadanka was not at all worried about this, because she was going to stick to the old plan, to portray a character from the original story, achieve separation from the. After this, the protagonist will have a heavenly existence. Rosetta will defeat all the villains who prevent others from living in peace. Moreover, she doesn't even have to take care of her luxurious home. For this, there is a whole squad of obedient, devoted footmen, cooks, guards. For a girl who had been forced to work hard all her past life and live in a poor, cramped closet, However, the maids took her thoughtfulness differently. They decided that the lady was remembering previous. The main character interrupts their whispering. With eyes shining with joy, she clarifies whether Isaac himself. The maids confirm that yes, the author of the letter is the Duke himself. But they are. Having come to her senses, she suggested that her subordinates consider all this simply a developed girl's intuition. Then the girl noticed that next to her was a basket full of fresh bread, and grabbed several. The main character ran back to her room, managing to shout to the surprised. Already in the Countess's bedroom, the duckling was devouring buns with might and main. The protagonist looked at this with incredible tenderness. Somehow this bird with a stuffed. Serena likes the duckling so much that she decides to consider it a gift from the gods. While feeding him, she mentally asks the higher powers for a successful break with Isaac. Then all the dreams. Suddenly, a man in aristocratic clothes bursts into the room, looking like Serena if she changed gender. And with a luxurious sobbing and wailing, he rushes to hug the blonde, calling her his little duckling. The parent hugs his daughter very tightly. It seemed to him that another refusal broke her already wounded heart, and he really wanted to somehow. The protagonist might have been able to appreciate such love, but the nervous Count did not calculate his. Having released his daughter, the man assured her that he had found. Having pulled himself together, the father, in a calm voice, began to explain to the main character who would become her next husband. Hearing that her new husband would be the leader of the Lion House of Richard, the protagonist, not very authentic, the Count rejoiced at this union much more than his daughter. He literally anticipated. The heroine did not say anything about this, but in her thoughts she asked her new father for forgiveness. Impatiently clenching his fists, the elder Count asks the girl to finally start getting ready, and she wonders why he is in such a hurry. As it turns out, Duke Richard is due to arrive at their estate today for a gala. The blonde could no longer resist this decision, so after a while the readers are shown how she stood in front of the mirror, surrounded by maids. Although it was not a wedding, but an ordinary meeting, the Count gave the order to dress Serena as beautiful, while the protagonist critically examined herself and reflected on the fact that accompanied by her maids, the young aristocrat approached the stairs. Serena tried to go down as beautifully and solemnly as possible. She still had the soul and memory of an inhabitant of modern Earth, not accustomed to such heavy. The main character falls from a high staircase, not even having time to fully realize what is happening, but it was too late and they couldn't make it in time. Closing her eyes in horror, the protagonist thought. Several very long and painful seconds pass. The fall stops, and Serena slowly opens her eyes, realizing that she does not feel pain from bruises and broken bones. As it turned out, Duke Isaac managed to save his intended bride. Right now he was carefully and tenderly pressing. To relieve the tense atmosphere, this yellow-eyed brunette jokes with a sly smile that he is greeted very warmly in the ethereal. Seeing the Duke so close and examining him in every detail, the protagonist was taken aback. She couldn't really say anything. She just opened her mouth. Isaac turned out to be inhumanly handsome. So much so that at that moment, all former plans to turn him away and live as a happy bachelor. Like a mad fan, the main character rushed to notice all the advantages of Richard's appearance, from the intelligent and strong-willed look of his golden eyes to his graceful nose. Ethereal herself at that moment looked more like a jellyfish. She was almost melting with pleasure, and even someone else's shout could not bring the blonde to her senses. But when it finally dawned on her, the girl realized with horror that during her dreams. After this, the action moves to the kitchen, where Serena, her parents, and Isaac were already sitting. Everyone pretended that no embarrassment had happened, but the protagonist could not calm down. If the situation allowed, she would simply cry, and in an attempt to drown out the stress, Ethereal devoured one snack after. The Duke stared at her intently with a strange expression on his face, and the young noblewoman began to sweat. She could not understand why the brunette was looking at her like that and what he was thinking about. Then Richard smiled, and this infuriated the hitchhiker. The girl decided that the man was simply mocking the bride who had disgraced herself. The main character recalled how, after falling down the stairs, she humiliated herself in front of an important guest, begging forgiveness for allowing herself to let go of her hands. But the worst thing was not even that, but the fact that the blonde's tongue was so tangled that she didn't immediately remember and say her name. Naturally, the Duke could not stand it, and giggled into his fist, which brought the protagonist to her senses. In order not to lose her faith, then it was worse. When Serena is very worried, she begins to blurt out everything that came. But while the girl quietly exhaled bile at Isaac and himself, the brunette Count Ethereal took this with delight, and immediately gave his consent. But then the mustachioed aristocrat said something that for the protagonist, the mother of the main character supported this idea. So the parents asked the young aristocrat. There was no way for unfortunate Serena to get away from such a demand, so she, pale with worry, had to lead her prospective husband. Even if she could get rid of the oppressive fear, the walk would still be unpleasant. Mainly unable to bear such pressure any longer, the blonde broke herself and started the man laconically agreed, but then immediately looked away, as if. The girl continued to try to interest the gentleman, asking him various questions and raising any. In the end, poor Ethereal experienced real panic. Only by miracle did she. In the end, the protagonist had a small breakdown, moving away and turning away. Tired of hypocritical politeness and attempts to interest the brunette, Serena decided to directly ask Isaac, but even such directness failed to confuse Richard. After this, it's his turn to unsettle his interlocutor. Seeing that Serena was shocked, Isaac explained normally. Objectively, she is a stunningly beautiful. This causes the unfortunate protagonist to experience mixed emotions. On the one hand, she even remembered the original main character of the story, the black-haired Rosetta from the house. So Serena decided to go back to her original plan. With a confused smile, she suggested that then there was simply no point in getting engaged. Continuing to grin and chuckle quietly, the Duke admitted that yes, it is, but in fact, one of the richest and most powerful people in the world was in. It was as if the woman was struck by a lightning strike. She was maintaining a kind of numb calm. Serena calmly asks again whether the protagonist doesn't even start a scandal. She silently puts her hand to her forehead and then the blonde furiously clenches her fist and grinds her teeth. She still had pride. Serena really wanted to say some kind words to the rich boor, but she had to restrain her. If she refuses the Duke right now, he will shrug his shoulders and leave, and it's not even a matter of the death of Rosetta alone. After her, most likely, the rest of the world will be destroyed. In the end, the blonde just smiles very kindly and widely, and asks Richard, not at all embarrassed, nods. Serena was the first girl in all of Delcata to be rejected. Having laughed very awkwardly and scratched the back of his head, observing these grimaces and actions, Isaac chuckles quietly and says this instantly infuriates the protagonist. She clenches her fists angrily, but what happened next instantly cooled the blonde's warlike ardor. Richard gently took her hand. Having playfully winked at his taken-aback interlocutor, the man decided to take his leave. He only said good. Meanwhile, it turned out that Serena's parents were watching every step, and his usually calm wife warmly supported him. After all, dreaming with pleasure, the man claims that the honeyed look that Richard cast at his daughter. The main character herself watched this with a distorted face. In her thoughts, and the Count and Countess had already begun a frenzy of activity. They were running around the room, deciding that it was time to immediately. Then they remembered their daughter, but only to drag her into shopping. It wasn't just a matter of being tired of her parents' misplaced enthusiasm. The protagonist already in the store, the young noblewoman tried on one dress after another. Serena's mother recognized this lady and respectfully addressed her as Madame Chariol. The main character froze, as if she heard thunder in the middle of a clear sky. Chariol is the head of a count family belonging to the fox totem, and she quickly shows her true face to the readers. This really irritates Serena's mom, but she doesn't stoop to outright scolding or exchanging passive-aggressive comments. She just thanks Chariol, and after this, Countess Ethereal takes full revenge on her sworn friend. Sharing the good news, the red-haired scoundrel almost drops her jaw to the floor, and all the other visitors to the store begin to whisper quietly. Chariol, having come to his senses, is trying to somehow spoil the blonde's mood. The eldest Ethereal answers this very simply. Isaac fell in love with her daughter. Not allowing the taken-aback gossip to get in even a word, the Countess hurries to take her leave along with the maid. Despite the verbal defeat, Chariol still left very satisfied. But then it turned out that this is exactly what the mother of the main character was counting on. Thanks to this fox, every dog in the area, and thanks to this, the shame from their home will. However, the trapped woman is not at all happy with these revelations. On the contrary, she hasn't changed her mind about ruining her engagement to Duke Richard. So after this, the action moves briefly into the future. This hectic day has finally. People in the ethereal estate were just getting ready to go. Finally reaching the bed, the unfortunate girl simply collapsed face down on it. She was so tired. As it turned out, the Countess spent the whole day dragging her daughter around the shops, turning over on her back. The girl summed up the situation. Suddenly, the already forgotten talking duckling returns to the story. The main character is very happy. The chick, continuing to behave like some kind of strict teacher, angrily squeezes its wings and stomps its paw, asking where the protagonist has been all day. He also asks if she was walking with that pompous lion. And Serena, not without embarrassment, the blonde admits to the intelligent bird that she somehow managed to. But the duck, as it turned out, was not at all interested in this. Already unable to bear his hysterical squeals, Ethereal covered her ears and shouted that she agreed to all the demands, if only he would. Having calmed down a little, the duckling explained that the protagonist has a certain purpose. With eyes shining with solemnity, the feathered one announces that Serena Ethereal, perhaps someone else in the place of the main character, would have rejoiced at the opportunity to. In addition, the duck is tired of all sorts of stupid, but since it is difficult for the trapped woman to remember, and this went against everything she had managed to imagine. Eiffel, getting irritated again, repeats, yes, she is the chosen heroine, and he won't talk about it anymore. But no wonder. The girl was torn apart by hysterical laughter. Tears flowed from her. Somehow, pulling herself together, Serena tried to explain everything to the duckling, but he, carefully taking it in her palm, the girl calmly explained that she was, in addition, this heroine and savior of the universe is destined to become a complete. Summarizing all of the above, the blonde decided that she would not be all. The next day, the intelligent duckling fluttered around Serena. The next day after this, Kays continued to pursue the protagonist, and the next day Ethel continues to scream and be indignant, proving to the obstinate bastard that he is not some noisy. Ethereal did not agree with this statement, and even drew a lion from her homeworld to show the arrogant bird what they really looked like. This infuriated Ethel even more, and he continued to shout, calling them. After some time, the day of the engagement came. A lot of nobles of all ranks came, although with her mind she understood the reason. Serena, to calm down, she took a drink from the waiter in an elaborate glass, and thought that suddenly, a young girl with a very unusual appearance, sparkling emerald green eyes, the platinum blonde sincerely congratulated. Deciding that this was some kind of aristocrat, Serena awkwardly replied that, fortunately, fate once again smiles on the long. From the small exhibition, readers will learn that in Delcata, small aristocrats are tired of being treated like dirt by all sorts of foxes, bears, and lions. These people decided to destroy. Arisha Brunhild is the only representative of the family who, after all this, upon learning of the evil deeds her relatives were planning, she turned away from them and instead helped her friend Rosetta. Remembering all these plot twists and dramas, Serena goes to, realizing that she stood for an unknown amount of time and stared at her like some kind. Fortunately, the blonde girl was not at all offended, so instead she hurries to introduce her older brother, Rascal Brunhild. Remembering the basics of noble etiquette, the main character makes. But then the protagonist suddenly remembers something very unpleasant. She has, having mentally ran through the pages of the original work, the wound was terrible. The blade pierced the brunette like a pin through a fragile butterfly. Watching his opponent bleed and slowly die, the young man felt no doubt, and right now, this intriguer, murderer smiled joyfully at. He extended his hand, trying to kiss the palm of the young aristocrat. But the man noticed this confusion. From the outside, it might have seemed that he was simply wondering if everything was fine with the newlywed, but his gaze became very cold and predatory. Thanks to titanic willpower, the girl pulls herself together. She feigns However, the protagonist understood that her talent as a hypocrite. She ran away so quickly that Rascal didn't even have time to say something goodbye. But when he came to his senses, the protagonist heard this perfectly well. And now, but then a fragment of a conversation reaches the girl's ears. It turned out to be two noble women. One suggested that ducks could somehow make others fall. To say that the main character was furious would be an understatement. And what is typical, perhaps Serena could not stand it, and forgetting about all decency, said something in response to the boorish people. But then it was Duke Isaac Richard in person. Smiling calmly, desperately blushing and hiding their eyes, the gossips tried to find an excuse for their behavior. Having heard the essence of the matter, Serena furiously frowned and bared her teeth. She decided that right now, the girl even remembered how he admitted to her a few days ago that he considered her failure, but everything turned out to be completely different. After that, Richard moved even closer to the young blonde, as if he was going to kiss her on the lips in front of hundreds of witnesses, without being at all embarrassed. This is exactly what happened in the end, and Serena was finally, after this, the man turns to the gossips and simply explains to them that he planned this, having hugged the desperately blushing girl even tighter. Duke the Lion Richard, the women look away and obediently agree, and it was clear from their eyes that now they regret that referring to some urgent matters, the Duke led Ethereal aside, and she even had to speed up her pace in order. Moving away from casual eyes, Serena finally gave vent to her feelings. The brunette calmly explained that in this way, he nipped in the bud the problems that the main character adds that when he saw the blonde next to those gossips, Having cooled down slightly, the protagonist shouts that she would never have done such a stupid thing. In response to this, the Duke playfully put his finger to the bride's lips. This simple, playful gesture was enough for the protagonist to completely fall out of reality. She just stood there for an unknown amount of time. It turned out that the main characters were standing near the altar, and an unknown voice from the audience nearby also prompts Ethereal to finally accept the wedding ring. She simply could not get that kiss out of her head, even though she believed that she did not love Isaac and disliked. The brunette slowly extended his hand to the blonde. Now she had to put a ring on one of his fingers. Looking at the simple but very expensive and beautiful ring, the protagonist hesitated for a moment. However, Serena gathers her strength and puts the jewelry on the man. Suddenly, a terrible roar is heard, as if the festival was attacked by unknown people in black cloaks and masks. The girl was so horrified at the sight of this sight that she became numb. Then a comedy scene happened. The main character met the gaze of one of the attackers, and he was also taken aback for a moment. As it turned out, the criminals invaded the celebration because they wanted to kill her, Serena. Now, having gotten rid of the guards and discovered the target, the remaining killers silently drew their blades and the protagonist was gripped by mortal horror. She pressed her palms to her and then an even more awkward moment came. It turned out that the killers didn't care about the blonde. For a moment, the main character experienced a strong feeling of awkwardness mixed with wounded pride. It was Isaac Richard, the young duke and great sorcerer. All this time, the huge two-handed blade of one of the assassins was engulfed in barred flame. Time seemed to stand still, looking straight into the face of the otherworldly killer. Serena, but most of all, the protagonist was worried about why Richard didn't do anything. He just stood. But at that moment, when there were only a few centimeters left to the fiery blade, the entire room was engulfed in a blinding white light. It was so strong and sharp that the blonde had to turn away, and not in vain. As it turned out, over the castle where the ceremony was held, as if a celestial star had fallen. When it finally subsided, all the attackers lay lifeless, as if some giant. However, several criminals survived. Having grabbed their unconscious comrades, they quickly hobbled towards the exit, wanting to regroup. Ethereal looked at this with incredible shock, and then she asked herself a question. Since it was from the stress she experienced, the girl collapsed to the ground, and the Duke immediately ran up to her, because no matter how unpleasant, having caught her breath slightly, the blonde joyfully rushed to hug her groom, having found herself literally within a hair's breadth. Richard was, however, surprised and discouraged by such a violent reaction. As if the heroine, this was partly true. From her worries, the young countess completely forgot that she was at least a head shorter than. However, such dryness on the part of her betrothed surprised her. Perhaps the girl had given up. Fortunately, this was the end of all the incidents. The engagement celebration ended. The main characters stood opposite each other in the palace garden. A light breeze fluttered Serena's dress and the Duke cracked his fingers slightly, but then said quietly, with a slight smile. After that, the man calmly turned around and some time had passed since then, and Richard made it a rule to send bouquets to the blonde every day. And now the young maid was enthused. Moreover, these were not banal roses or chrysanthemums, but the matter was not limited to flowers. Then the aristocrat began to pamper the bride with more expensive gifts. For example, the girl began to receive diamonds, rubies, emeralds, pearls, and other jewelry every day. However, there was some truth in this statement. The Duke, however, Serena was not in the mood to continue playing at happy newlyweds. Having arrived in the brunette characteristically was in no hurry to reveal all the cards at once. The slightly discouraged countess listed, first flowers, then jewelry. The young head of the ducal house only modestly lowers his eyes and notes that he is now her fiancé. This took the protagonist by surprise. She could not logically object to her betrothed, but according to the plot, in just a few days, a great thing will happen, where Isaac will break all ties with Serena in order to then. She hasn't forgotten about her dream of spending the rest of her life in happy and prosperous solitude. And now the situation is as if the brunette really. Observing the moral torment of the bride, the protagonist interpreted them in his own way and asked if. And then Isaac demonstrated that he could teach Serena a few lessons in the unfortunate girl grabbed her head, feeling as if she was in some kind of absurd comedy of the absurd. The heroine perfectly remembered how the Duke told her to her face, no, if this had happened under completely different circumstances, The protagonist would have been sincerely glad, but she remembered very well that very soon, Rosetta, the black-haired girl, the brunette measured the blonde with a very tenacious and attentive gaze, like a hawk, and this scared Serena. She could not know what the strong. Therefore, Ethereal decided to play a comedy again. Putting on a smile, she cooed that this was sheer stupidity. The Duke pretends that this answer satisfied him, after which he graciously nods, but before taking another sip of the hot drink, the man casually admits that regardless of the answer, looking up at the blonde, Isaac smiles predatorily and says meaningfully, "This frightens and discourages the girl even more than the blow of a huge fiery blade." She could only open her mouth like a fish. In the end, she simply hugged herself with her arms, like a victim. In the evening, the Duke returns to his luxurious estate paved with white stone. Laconically agreeing, the main character began to undress. While he looked very tired, as if Isaac had been carrying terrible weights on his own. Taking off his shirt in front of the mirror, Richard showed the audience his thin. In fact, on the back of the young aristocrat, there was a witchcraft mark. Black, similar to a terrible spider, it one day gloomily looking at himself in the mirror. The main character recalled how he initially missed. Then Isaac found out that it was a very powerful curse and began to look for ways. The Duke had no idea when and why he was cursed, so it was impossible to find. The protagonist thought longingly about his life. Yes, he was born into a great and rich. No matter how much effort Richard put in, the reward for this was the realization. In his thoughts, he confirms that Serena Ethereal was initially just another way for. She tried to get married 3 times and was left alone 3 times. So Isaac was interested in looking at this walking. Of course, for a feudal society, marriage is a very important matter that can strengthen noble families. So he initially planned to do exactly what the protagonist expected. But everything went wrong after the engagement ceremony. When they were attacked by unknown villains, it was Serena. The point was not even that the blonde somehow created very powerful magic. The man had no idea what all this could mean and what the nature of the bride's abilities was. But he perfectly saw, and if Serena Ethereal one day in the future manages to destroy the curse completely, then Isaac will never part with her. Meanwhile, the girl herself wakes up in her bed. She was sweating terribly and scared. Besides her, there was also a young maid in the room. She left a large bouquet of roses on the main character switches the topic, claiming that everything is in order and she is interested in the latest news. The blonde is quite surprised by this because it is only 8 in the morning. But in her thoughts, she decides at the thought that she would have to watch his handsome but terribly smug. Serena even remembered their last conversation. Then she tried to hint to the unwanted groom. The Duke pretended that he did not understand anything. And then the blonde, embarrassed, gave another hint. Richard repelled this attack very easily. He replied with a slight. The protagonist had no arguments against this, but she thought with sadness that the man. Fortunately, the ill-fated ball will take place in just a week, so there is very little time left to endure. Encouraged by this, the maid, a little embarrassed, replied that Isaac was not at the estate. Thus, another guest showed up at the estate, who for some reason wants to meet Serena in person and so early. From such news, the protagonist opens her eyes in shock. The mysterious guest turned out to be Rascal Brunhild from the Goose's house. While he was pouring tea with a calm smile, the heroine was trying to understand with quiet, looking at his very good-natured, femininely beautiful face. Serena, having finished the tasting, the blonde young man politely asked the mistress of the estate how she was doing. Having become nervous, the protagonist awkwardly and quickly said that yes, everything was fine with her, and Brunhild was not at all embarrassed by this reaction. On the contrary, continuing to portray a hospitable hostess, the main character, however, the young man pretended to come to his senses. Because of the pleasant and relaxed atmosphere, after that, the blonde put his palm in his bosom. This innocent and natural gesture literally shackled the unfortunate girl with horror, as if she were a rabbit that found itself right in front of a hungry wolf. She remembered a passage from the original novel, when Rascal, maintaining an innocent appearance, also put his hand into his bosom in order to remove a dagger from under his jacket. A terrible blade sparkled in his grip. Like a steel fang, it could easily end the life of a person who did not bother to wear any protection. This is how Brunhild finished off Count Hayes, who received him cordially, not suspecting that the guest from the younger family was planning a terrible crime. Hayes was Rosetta's father, making her and Rascal sworn enemies. And a chill ran down Serena's spine as she realized how similar her situation was to that one. With quietly growing panic, she thought that the blonde aristocrat had come to kill her, and the visitor himself, noticing the acute reaction of the young ethereal, stopped for a moment. Brunhild looked straight into Serena's eyes and smiled from the corner of her lips. This made the protagonist panic even more, deciding that the villain had definitely come after her soul. Slowly, as if taking out a knife or pistol, the man pulled out from under his jacket an object wrapped in a thin and harmless-looking paper wrapper. The hit woman's nerves couldn't stand it. With a loud squeal, she hugged herself by the shoulders and collapsed onto the back of the sofa, desperately hoping that nothing bad would happen. After this, an awkward moment came. As it turned out, Rascal was not pulling out a weapon, but an ordinary letter, and he watched with slight shock the acute reaction of the aristocrat. The protagonist herself was so amazed that the cold-blooded intriguer and killer was not going to settle scores with her that at first she couldn't even say anything sensible. The young man, meanwhile, became worried. Had he somehow offended and frightened Ethereal, who had welcomed him into her home with such cordiality? Fortunately, by this moment the main character came to her senses and came up with the idea that she was actually afraid not of Rascal, but of a bee that flew into the living room from the kindergarten. The nobleman was not very trusting of this explanation, but Ethereal immediately added that as a child she was stung painfully by a bee, and since then she has been scared every time she notices a hint of the presence of such insects near her. The blonde respectfully replied that if such trouble happened again, he would try to catch the obnoxious insect, but the girl hastened to hush up the incident, answering that it flew home anyway. Only after this does the young nobleman turn his gaze to the only window in the living room, and it remained closed throughout his entire presence in the mansion. The main character's already not very convincing lies began to fall apart at the seams, but the girl, desperately sweating and scratching the back of her head, suggested that the window had somehow miraculously closed on its own. Fortunately for her, the future antagonist decided not to develop this topic any further, but, on the contrary, to put the brakes on it. Brunhild laughed politely, saying that it was a good joke. After this, the young man returned to the topic. He said that he had been instructed to convey to Serena a certain message, which was now lying on the table, wrapped in an envelope. The girl took it in her hands with slight apprehension. Although the danger had passed, she still remembered very well that Brunhild was destined to become one of the most dangerous villains, and was careful. As the nobleman explained, the letter was actually written by his sister Arisha, whom the protagonist met at the ceremony, but the girl got sick and therefore asked her brother to convey the text for her. The main character was surprised. It seemed strange and unusual to her that the girl, with whom the real Serena did not seem to interact, decided to communicate. Having opened the envelope and taken out the letter, Ethereal realized with sadness that once again the villainous fate had played a dirty trick on her. Arisha's handwriting was monstrously illegible. The Papadka tried her best to read what was written, squinting her eyes and turning the paper over from different angles. But to no avail, she could just as easily count grains of sand in a muddy river. Rascal, hitherto silently waiting for some kind of answer, directly asked the interlocutor if she had finished, and the girl, getting excited, hastily replied that yes, she had read everything. After this, the young man directly asked what Serena's answer would be, and his question gave off some kind of eerie chill, which made the protagonist shiver again. Quietly panicking, the former dugout decided to say the first thing that came to her mind. Yes, this would be an incredibly wonderful option, and she completely agrees with it. There was some logic in her words. The author of the letter was Arisha, not her brother. She would not become a villain, which means nothing bad should happen. But the trapped woman was still sweating with fear. Fortunately, the guest limited himself to respectfully placing his hand on his chest and thanking the mistress of the estate for her answer, adding that his sister would be very pleased with this answer. But a second later, it turned out that the text contained an invitation. For some reason, Arisha wanted Serena to appear at Brunhild's estate, and now Rascal was asking if the ethereal would like to take a carriage ride with him. The poor heroine felt driven into a corner. Now she is actually forced to go to the nest of a family of intriguers and murderers. from where it is not certain that she will be able to leave. Naturally, she was not at all happy about entering this snake tangle of her own free will. So the former dugout decided by hook or by crook to postpone the trip. Stuttering slightly and looking away, the protagonist said that she was very glad for this honor, but she still had some things to finish, and could the Brunhildes wait until the evening? Rascal cast a discouraging look at his interlocutor and asked if she planned to refuse the invitation, and in his gaze there was so much cold contempt, as if the young man was about to kill a vile cockroach. The young noblewoman realized with horror that she must under no circumstances irritate this man, no matter how cold-blooded he may seem. If he crosses the line, the consequences will be dire. Sweating even more, Ethereal lied that she actually wanted to find some kind of gift, because showing up empty-handed is bad manners. But the young man does not give the girl this loophole either. With a sweet smile, he claims that material gifts are unnecessary, because Serena's very appearance is the best gift. Thus the blonde had no choice but to drop everything and go to Brunhilde's estate, as beautiful and impressive as that of the ethereal count. But now the unfortunate woman did not care about the external gloss. She mentally sobbed and reproached herself for not bothering to properly decipher Arisha's handwriting. The hero of the occasion herself was in a hurry to meet the guest. Like a child, delighted that the kind grandfather Frost had finally come to him with a bag of gifts, Rascal carefully straightened the fur cape on her shoulders and reproachfully added that she should not have gone out. Her condition could worsen from the cold outside. The younger sister only smiled in response. She was sorry, but when she heard about Serena's appearance, Arisha was so happy that everything else flew out of her head. Looking at how tender and affectionate this murderer is with his younger relative, the protagonist involuntarily wondered whether he really loved her or whether this was another element of his image of a good aristocrat. Having finished the conversation with Rascal, the blonde girl made an elegant curtsy to the guest. She was not even sure that she would agree to such an unexpected proposal. After that, Arisha invited the main character to come to the estate, and the poor girl had to agree, although she would have gladly given the trouble. But walking slowly along the tiled road, Serena reassured herself that nothing bad should happen. She would just drink tea with her friend and go home. However, considering how often the former dugout managed to get into trouble literally out of the blue, she herself could not believe her arguments. Inside, Brunhilde's mansion was furnished very beautifully and tastefully. There was no flashy luxury, only snow-white walls with silver engravings, flowering plants, and expensive carpets. Among the attractions of the estate was a large painting. It depicted the entire clan, including the absent parents of Arisha and Rascal. Looking at all this beauty, Serena was surprised against her will. On some subconscious level, she was sure that she would end up in the stereotypical castle of the Dark Lord. Then the girls reached the living room. Like the rest of the estate, it was made in light colors with the addition of dark wood and blue furniture. Carefreely fiddling with the dishes, Arisha asked Ethereal what kind of tea she would like, regular chamomile or Earl Grey, and the protagonist gave preference to the latter. Humming some song, the girl with white hair began to pour the drink into cups. It was clear that she was incredibly happy at the opportunity to honor the visitor. Having finished, Brunhilde lightheartedly admitted that due to her poor health, she very rarely leaves the house and meets people, so guests are a real holiday for her. Arisha was so filled with joyful emotions that she even grabbed Serena's hand and asked if she wouldn't mind stopping by for a visit from time to time. The blonde turned around, casting an angry glance at Rascal, who was leaning his back against the wall. The protagonist angrily thought that she would not have stepped here if not for the threats. The youngest of the Brunhildes clearly felt the discomfort and doubts of her new friend, so she decided to resort to the most effective and last resort: puppy dog eyes. Her pale cheeks turned pink, and her eyes, green as emeralds, sparkled with tears. Even an inveterate scoundrel could not refuse such charm, and the main character naturally could not. Seeing such beauty, she herself blushed and exclaimed enthusiastically that she would definitely come to visit again. Arisha was happy. She finally had a person who could be called a friend, a person who would visit her and talk about everything. Looking at all this sincere and ingenuous enthusiasm, the young countess even looked away. It was so cute that it was impossible to look for a long time. But then, the sick girl with a sad sigh recalls the attack on the wedding, It must have been monstrously stressful for the protagonist. Then she adds that the target of the attackers, as it became known, was Duke Isaac Richard, and Brunhild is interested in whether Serena was not harmed as a result of this. Awkwardly putting her hand to her chest, Ethereal lies that everything ended well for her and the groom, and she is very sorry that it all ended this way, and asks a counter-question. Was Arisha able to get home safely after this? Hearing an inappropriate apology, Sister Rascal waves her hands. There is nothing to ask for forgiveness in such a situation. It was impossible to foresee and prevent this. And after that, she confirms that she also remained unharmed, and all thanks to the fact that her beloved older brother was nearby, which would not allow her sister to be offended. Seeing how sweetly and familiarly the siblings coo, the protagonist reflects with slight regret what a blow the truth about Rascal's true nature will be for Arisha. Slowly getting up, the main character admits to herself that she expected much more terrible results from her visit to the Brunhild estate, but so far everything has been good. But immediately after this, troubles begin. The green-eyed blonde's face turns dark red, and she clutches her throat in an attempt to breathe. The unfortunate girl was seized by a cough of monstrous force. She bent in half and could not even answer the panicked guest or her frightened brother. Rascal put his arm around his younger sister's shoulders with genuine concern. He reminded the sick girl that she needed to rest as often as possible to recover. Turning to the stunned Serena, the young man said with slight regret that it was better to end the reception at this point, but he was ready to see his guest off. Ethereal did not argue. All the way she felt discomfort from being in this place, and after such an incident, the desire to stay in it completely disappeared. As it turned out, the main character spent many hours in the Brunhild mansion. When she came out, accompanied by her brother and sister, midday gave way to sunset. Now Arisha was apologizing to the Countess. She was very uncomfortable because of her attack, but the blonde with blue eyes hastened to assure her new friend that everything was fine. Rascal, approaching the woman, was about to wish her an easy journey and good luck. But then the attention of the other characters was attracted by someone's panicked cry. It turned out to be the youngest daughter of the Brunhild family. The girl was so frightened by something in the distance that even now, pointing her finger at the threat, she could not stop trembling. Soon, Serena realized what frightened her new friend so much. It turned out to be a huge ball, as if consisting of black-violet flame, and it was moving straight towards them. The spectacle turned out to be so unnatural and creepy that the woman from Earth, who had seen magic only a few times, froze in fear until she realized that the terrible cloud was really approaching quickly. With great difficulty, as if her whole body had turned into unyielding metal and stone, the protagonist turned her head to Arisha. She wanted to take the sick noblewoman to a safe place. But Ethereal, unfortunately, could not even move her tongue. In addition, Brunhild herself froze and looked at the approaching death like a hypnotized rabbit. Then Serena remembered Arisha's older brother, but to her surprise, Rascal also froze like a pillar of salt, watching as the once red sky was covered with a purple glow. But if the girls were mentally ready to say goodbye to life, the man looked much calmer and smiling faintly, almost like Isaac Richard during the attack. Seeing this sly and contented grin, the protagonist was struck by a terrible guess. Was the deadly ball of violet flame really the work of Rascal? Then she also remembers the enchanted swords of the killers from the engagement ceremony. Their blades at some point became covered with a very similar energy, only red. Then the heroine came to her senses and turned back to the purple cloud, but it was already too close. Now the unfortunate people had no way to escape. The young aristocrat turned away and closed her eyes. She was too afraid to look death in the face, so she did not notice the second appearance of the mystical light. But this time it was not her who was the source. Realizing that she was still alive and well, Serena opened her eyes and saw Rascal destroying the eerie cloud with silvery spells. When it completely dissipated, the white haze slowly retracted back into the man's hand, like a genie forced to return to the lamp before being summoned again by its owner. Having finally removed his spell, the blonde wizard added without much alarm that the warriors guarding the estate had probably lost their caution while they were training. He, as the owner of the mansion and the leader of the Brunhild family in the absence of his parents, was ashamed of such an incident, and he made an official apology to Ethereal. However, this not only did not reassure the guest, but even angered her. She almost saw the light at the end of the tunnel again, and this blonde scoundrel laughs it off, calling the incident carelessness. In addition, the woman was not going to forget what Rascal's first reaction was to the appearance of this magical cloud. He simply looked at it instead of immediately protecting his guest and sister. This was the last straw that broke the camel's back. Serena no longer cared about how dangerous her brother Brunhild was, and she was about to say a few kind words to him, but unexpectedly failed. She felt very bad. Like a person who was close to losing consciousness, Ethereal staggered, could not clearly utter even short words. The protagonist's eyes seemed to turn into a black haze. She could hardly make out Arisha standing right in front of her, frightened by the guest's similar reaction. The blonde girl carefully took her new friend by the shoulders and tried to tell her something, but Serena did not hear anything. The dizziness became even stronger. In the end, the young countess collapsed to the ground. Before losing consciousness, she managed to think that her legs could not support her, and heard screams addressed to her on the verge. The siblings managed to carefully move the main character onto the sofa, but no one could understand what had happened to Ethereal and how she could be helped. The protagonist had already awakened by this moment. From the outside, she still seemed asleep, but consciousness began to gradually return to the hostess. Arisha scolded her brother. Rascal swore an oath that he would not do anything to this innocent girl, and now she almost died before their eyes. However, the schemer noticed that their visitor was beginning to awaken from fainting and ordered the relative to shut up, not knowing that the woman had already heard everything. If you didn't know the backstory, you could have thought that the blonde had simply taken a nap and was now having difficulty waking up after a long sleep. She somehow opened her blue eyes and looked surprised. While Arisha began to fuss around her new friend, trying to make sure she was well, Rascal just looked on, very calmly and indifferently, which even infuriated the protagonist. As it turned out, the characters are in a carriage. The brother and sister managed to carefully transport the visitor and are now returning her to her home. The youngest of the Brunhilds was very sorry that the first visit ended so unsuccessfully. First she was seized by an attack, and then because of the magical training of the knights, a tragedy almost happened. While Arisha was sincerely worried about Serena, seeing her as a friend, Rascal continued to sit and watch like a stone idol, annoying the mistress. Very quickly, the carriage of aristocrats from the House of the Goose arrived at the ethereal estate, and the protagonist, still reeling from fainting, prepared to get out of the transport. Unexpectedly, the older brother Brunhild gave her his hand and smiled affectionately. For some reason, he decided to again portray a good-natured and friendly young man. Serena painfully did not want to even touch him. It was disgusting for her, but she remained too weak and slipped on her heel. Fortunately, the blonde deigned to save the trapped girl, grabbing her by the shoulders in time, and even asked if she was okay. The protagonist was embarrassed. The situation turned out to be very awkward, and besides, it also caused a feeling of déjà vu. But then another voice was heard in the air, which made everyone flinch. It turned out to be, of course, Duke Richard. He seemed to be waiting in ambush to appear and confuse everyone, and when he saw the bride in the company of another man, he decisively approached and took the blonde by the hand. Rascal bowed respectfully to the higher-ranking aristocrat, but the brunette paid no attention to this and contemptuously asked what Brunhild allowed himself to do. Serena hastened to explain that nothing like that happened. She simply fell. And the blonde helped her hold on, but it was still as if lightning had struck between the guys. The situation was heating up. Although no one had yet stooped to insults or come in with fists, it was as if an Arctic cold had blown on the warm street, frightening the women. Not wanting to witness another scandal, especially after such stress, Ethereal took the situation into her own hands. She thanked Arisha for the reception, and then pushed her and her brother into the carriage. Making sure that the danger had passed, the blonde wiped the sweat from her forehead, sighed with relief, and then explained to the groom that she was going to visit new acquaintances in his absence. Isaac's reaction surprised her very much. The Duke approached the bride from behind and then poked her shoulder like a cat, and gently asked her to warn her about meetings with other men in the future. Taken aback, the protagonist hastened to explain that she was actually going to see Arisha, but Richard capriciously demanded not to meet with Rascal. He was allegedly jealous. Already in the house, the duckling Ethel, who was watching the scene from somewhere, parodied the Duke, quoting him in a nasty voice and greatly irritating the excited Serena. The chick, however, did not listen and continued to clown around, making the blonde desperately blush and hiss with monstrous awkwardness. Only after that did the god in the form of a duck stop and begin to furiously scold the main character, blaming her for the fact that she is still not preparing to save the world, but instead wastes time on such nonsense as novels. Mentally, the blonde rolled her eyes and sighed. Ethel again brought up his favorite topic, and she repeated as strictly as possible that she was not going to save any planets. The chick reacts furiously to the fact that he has just been compared to a duckling again, but the woman, with shown indifference, scratches her ear with her little finger. Yes, yes, he is a lion, just let him calm down. After that, they quarreled a little more, and then the little girl went to bed. Fortunately, over time, Ethel began to bother her much less often with his missions, and she also got used to the Duke and his escapades. Soon the day came when, in the original story, Isaac mercilessly abandoned Serena in front of dozens of people to meet Rosette. The debutante ball is a very important event for the aristocracy of Delcata, at which young noble women show themselves to society for the first time, and on the 300th, it will be time to show themselves to the brunette from the House of the Leopard. The protagonist thought so deeply about the near future, and that very soon her fate would change dramatically, that she did not immediately notice how Richard addressed her. She assured the groom that everything would be fine, and then again plunged into her thoughts. Serena felt better than ever in this world, and was already looking forward to final freedom. The blonde imagines this moment very vividly, how the brunette announces the breakup with a sadistic grin. Yes, it will be unpleasant, because it will happen in front of many people, but for the sake of a happy future, the protagonist is ready to endure it. And at the same time, Ethereal could not help but admire the groom. He was so handsome that it was impossible to take his eyes off, even knowing the subsequent events. Serena was a little sad that this was the last time she would see Isaac up close. But the blonde was still not going to deviate from the old plan, and once again assured the man that she was fine.